Welcome committee members, liaisons, and members of the public to the Legal Services Trust Fund Committee Program Development and Impact Committee meeting. Thank you for joining us. We are using Zoom with the goal to foster a more inclusive environment and effective meeting. If you would like to comment during the meeting, please use the raise hand feature. Please utilize this tool to virtually indicate that you would like to speak in order to help the chair facilitate the discussion. A friendly reminder that this is a video conference. Per Bagley King requirements, all cameras must be kept on for the duration of the meeting. If you're unable to have your camera on, you must indicate a reason for the interference during the meeting. Please be aware that your surroundings behind you. All meetings will be recorded and posted to the State Bar's website. Zoom captioning is available. To enable, select live transcript at the bottom of your Zoom screen, then select enable transcript. Thank you.
Thanks, Kim. Chris, would you like to take roll?
Yes. All right. Happy lunch, everybody. Alakani, absent. Babcock.
Here.
Campbell.
Here.
Escobedo. Absent. Morales. Absent. Smith.
Present.
And Judge Rossi.
I am here.
That's 4 voting members present, 3 absent. So we do have a quorum. And I'll now call roll for advisors and liaisons and staff. Judge Yang. Absent. For liaisons, Selena Copeland.
I am present.
Hi, Selena. Thank you for joining us. Lauren Klein. Absent. Zach Newman. Absent. I think Zach might be joining later. Melanie Snyder from the Judicial Council. Absent. And Ewan Kim from the Judicial Council. Absent. For State Bar staff, I'm noting that I, Chris McConkey, am present. Director Dwan Nguyen, absent. Crystal is listening. Shannon is absent. Kim Turner will be joining us. Sylvia is taking the minutes. And we have Danielle McCrae. And then we'll have Jennifer Zelnick joining us as a presenter soon. And also Mara will be joining us. And that concludes the roll, Judge Rossi.
Thank you, Chris. Okay, this is the time where we ask if there are members of the public who wish to comment on any item on our agenda. We ask that you keep the public comments to 2 minutes, and we also ask that any comment that you make concern an agenda item or something within the subject matter of our committee, and not on something that we don't have jurisdiction over. Kim, is there anyone in the attendee pool, participants who have their hand raised?
Yeah, no one has their hand raised.
Okay. Then we will dispense quickly with public comment and move on to the chair's report. Welcome again, everyone. As a reminder to everyone, the purpose and role of the PDI committee is to advance the Trust Fund Commission's support for legal aid through new initiatives, innovations, and stakeholder engagement while ensuring effective evaluation and communication of program impacts. And we are going to do just that today. We have 4 items on our agenda. The first is an RFP for the next California Housing Finance Agency CalHFA grant. We have an update on how the commission administers Cypre funds. We're going to talk about the State Bar and Trust Fund Commission's work on the California Legal Aid Interagency Roundtable. And then we will also talk about our ongoing legal aid data project. We may take things out of order just to accommodate presenter schedules, but we will start with the RFA. just as soon as we dispense with other housekeeping. And that is all I think I have. Chris, do you have a staff report you'd like to give?
I do, thank you. So I have some brief updates from a few of the committee's working groups and thought partnerships, and then one more administrative update. So some of the members of this committee sit on these working groups, so already know these updates, but their peers don't. So feel free to weigh in if you want to add any flavor to this. But for the Community Justice Worker Working Group, and as a reminder, this is a working group that came about to look at a proposal that originated from legal aid, not the state bar, like the Legal Services Trust Fund Commission, but from several legal services organizations in California. So that working group has met twice, or at least twice, to discuss the proposal. They plan to meet again very soon. It also plans to share a draft of a letter, the letter to the CJW proposal authors. They're going to share the draft with this committee at its meeting on October 24th. Additionally, State Bar staff plan to update the Board of Trustees about the working group's progress and the proposal that's from legal aid when the Board of Trustees meets in September. And we'll work to incorporate any feedback from this committee and the Board of Trustees as appropriate. For this committee's working group looking at legal technology, the name of it's the Legal Aid Justice Tech Collaborative Working Group. It has also met at least twice to review a report that you've all heard from Harbor, the consultant, Harbor Labs, and to discuss additional priorities and deliverables that the working group wishes to include in the Legal Aid Justice Tech Collaborative Work Plan. That working group will meet again in September to review a draft of the work plan, which it will present to this committee. So this committee is going to be hearing from that working group and also the CJW working group at its meeting in October. And it's also going to be presenting State Bar staff to the Board of Trustees at its September meeting. So sort of a similar cadence. And then my third sort of working group update is on the post. It's the changing federal and state landscapes. We call it a thought partnership. It's not quite a working group. That thought partnership of commissioners and state bar staff is helping to guide 3 upcoming convenings in California that are regional convenings where state bar staff and commissioners can actually meet with programs where they're at. So one will be in Davis on October 10th. One will be in LA on October 21st. Most commission grantees are, or that's or the largest concentration for any county of commission grantees. And then the Bay Area will be in San Francisco. So October 10, October 21, and November 3. Those convenings will be organized around the theme of resiliency in crisis in this like rapidly changing world. And will highlight the State Bar's forthcoming impact brief on the changing federal and state landscapes, including funding, which implicates legal aid. And so thank you for each of the committee members that sit on one or more of those working groups for being thought partners with State Bar staff and working with legal aid to look at those really exciting proposals. My last update is just more of an administrative one, which is I am equal parts sad and excited that the sad part is this is my last PDI committee meeting as committee coordinator, because the exciting part is I'm moving over to become committee coordinator for the GES committee. So for this committee's next meeting, which will be in October, you can get very excited that you'll have my colleague Danielle McRae, who's on right now, who will be an even more dutiful committee coordinator. You'll forget all about me when I'm gone because Danielle's going to have it so covered. So Danielle, I don't know if you want to say anything.
Oh, I did not have remarks prepared, but very excited to work with you all and get going in October. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And that concludes the staff report, Judge Rossi. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. And on behalf of the PDI committee, and I know that all of my colleagues on this committee share this, we are incredibly grateful for all the work that you have done for us over the last, gosh, it's been almost a year. It's been a while, huh? All the work that you've done and folks who've been on the commission know just how hard State Bar staff work to get everything rolling for these meetings and to make them go smoothly. They go smoothly not because of the person chairing the meeting, but in fact because of State Bar staff. And so I am eternally grateful to you, as are the rest of the committee members, I am sure. And we will miss you. And we are also excited to have Danielle join us. Danielle and I worked together on stuff at when I was on COAF, and so we know each other. And if you don't know Danielle, well, she is also an exceptionally hard worker, and so we are very grateful to have you on board. So thank you. Okay, let's move on to the minutes from our last meeting. So we last met on June 11th. And so we need to approve those minutes. Those minutes were attached to the agenda, so hopefully everyone got a chance to look at those.
I'll make a motion to approve.
Thank you, Erin.
I'll second.
Thank you, Vanetta. Any changes, comments to the minutes? Seeing none, then Chris, would you like to call a vote?
Yes, thank you. So with 4 voting members present, we do have quorum, and I have Commissioner Smith moving and Commissioner Campbell seconding.
Yes.
Alakani, absent. Babcock,
Even though I was not present at the June meeting, I have confidence in the accuracy of the record and the actions of my fellow members, so I vote to approve.
thank you. Campbell,
Yes.
Escobedo, absent. Morales, absent. Smith,
Yes.
and Judge Rossi.
Yes.
That is 4 yeses, 0 nos, 3 absent, 0 abstentions, so motion passes.
Thank you, Chris. Thanks, everyone. All right, moving along to our first item of business, and that is the approval of the 2025 to 2029 CalHFA 2 grant. And I would love to invite Mara, who I think is already here to present on this for us. And Mara, we cannot see you, but we see that you are here.
I'm in a
Oh, there you are.
conference
You're in
and-
2 places.
I am in 2
Misdirection.
places at once. I find being in 2 places at once helps nowadays. So I will share my screen and we can get this going. Okay.
And it looks, Mara, for me at least, it looks a
Smushed.
little smushed, like maybe it's not in presentation mode.
Oh, it is. So one moment, I have a backup.
Take your time.
You have such a clean desktop. Mine's the exact opposite. Mine's like Michael Scott from The Office.
Selena will be screen sharing next.
Perfect.
I always count people's tabs if they screen share and you see their browser. I'm like, do you have as many tabs as I have?
Oh, that's where I make up for the clean desktop.
Sometimes.
All right, let's try this again.
Mm.
See if Adobe behaves any better. No.
It's still smushed.
Okay.
And that's also the PowerPoint for, it looks like investment policy.
I can find the PowerPoint, Mara, and share my screen if you like.
It feels less smushed.
Yeah, and it's still the wrong PowerPoint. All right, we're having some technical difficulties. The curse continues.
That's
That's
okay.
That's okay, Mara. I'll pull it up for you and I can share my screen. Just give me one moment.
Okay, while you're doing that, I'll just remind everyone that when we did the charters for the new committee structure for the Trust Fund Commission, one of the things that the PDI committee was going to be in charge of and is in charge of are new funding sources, right? And so that's one of the reasons why this is being brought to us today for approval. It is a new funding source, and we are excited that that is part of PDI's charter. So that is why it is coming here today and not the other committee.
So I
And
do
we-
have it
Sure.
up, Mara, if you would like me to share my screen.
Seeing as I cannot get the correct one up, we would appreciate that.
It
And
would be my pleasure.
I am looking at the title of the file. I am clicking the title of the file and the wrong one keeps loading. So
No problem.
thank you for swooping
Of
in.
course. Can everyone see my slides? Mara's slides. Very good. Okay.
Yes.
Mara,
we
you can
see
just
mine.
steer me. I'll click through them for you.
That'd be great. Thanks. I'm ready for the next slide. Thank you for the introduction, Judge Rosie.
Yeah, of course. Nice to have you here.
So I'll be going over the grant parameters, the grant overviews, our application as proposed, and then walking through the selection criteria, scoring rubric, reporting requirements of this grant, and then finally the timeline leading us to a resolution on this proposed RFP. So this new funding opportunity has permissible uses involving home ownership, protecting home equity, and preventing homeowner displacement through foreclosure prevention. It will also allow other activities, including loan modification assistance, litigation against mortgage service violations, debt collection defense, and other related consumer protection services. Similar to CalHFA 1, but some variation there. Eligibility is limited to homeowners living at or below 150% of the AMI.
Can I jump in on that one too, Mara, and to say that like Mara mentioned, the permissible uses for that CalHFA, the agency expects to see for CalHFA $2, she said was the same as for CalHFA 1. That eligibility criterion for clients is also the same. It is specific to homeowners and incomes up to 150% of AMI can be quite a bit above what the commission's normal income cutoff is for the funds that's statutorily authorized to administer, which is usually 200% of federal poverty. So to the extent that grantees, and the commission's had a few grants where this has been the case, to the extent that grantees receive these dollars and serve homeowners that are who live above 200% of federal poverty, they'll need to track that to report their qualified expenditures on their annual AOLTA application. I'll just offer the anecdote though that for CalHFA 1, it's like, well, Mara, you can agree or disagree, but it's like overwhelmingly very, very low income homeowners that kind of seek out and get these services. So there actually is a tremendous amount of overlap in those income categories.
Thanks, Chris. The sources we discussed in our previous update is the passage of ABA 130, which was signed at the end of June. This was with respect to the use of California Natural Mortgage Settlement Funds. The grant amount in total will be $24 million, up to 8% of which will be available for the State Bar for administrative costs. Any amount of those funds the State Bar does not expend, we would distribute out to grantees. But at the face of it, it would be about $2,080,000 specifically for awards to grantees. The project funding is divided into two portions. When it comes to grantee application, they will be able to apply for up to $2.8 million in project funding. And then as a unique new opportunity that we're really excited about, we are including an optional fellowship funding opportunity as a part of this grant. And grantees or applicants rather will be able to apply for up to $80,000 for the additional fellowship funding. So Applicants may choose to apply only for project funding, which would limit them to $2.8 million in project funding. And if they choose to apply for fellowships and they choose to apply for the maximum, $3.6 million would be available, assuming that they apply for the maximum on both parts. The grant period will run from December 1st of this year through June 30th, 2029. And the grantees are going to be able to charge for qualified services that are provided from July 1. Next slide. Going back to the days of the old slide carousel. Thank you, Chris. Fellow eligibility and limits within 3 years of law school graduation is the limit for fellows funded through this grant. Funding for law graduate fellows will be allowed for both regularly and provisionally licensed lawyers. The fellowships are permissible up to 2 years long, but we do not put a minimum limit on that. And the reason behind that is we wanted programs to have the flexibility to design fellowships that really met the needs of their projects. So they do have flexibility in that respect. They, however, are only able to have 2 fellows at a time per grantees. So the number of fellows they apply for will really be determined by how they design the fellowship, how it fits into the project proposals. In terms of salary requirements, we are requiring that the salary and benefits for the law graduate fellows follow the organization's current policies for entry-level attorneys, and we will be looking for supporting documentation with respect to those salary and benefit schedules. Next slide.
Can I, since you're about to move on to another topic, Mara, can I add something about the fellowship piece?
Sure.
So, and I think you might have mentioned this, Mara, at the commission meeting on August 8th, so I might just be resurfacing this idea, but Mara was saying that both CalHFA and the State Bar are very excited at this idea that CalHFA 2 can incorporate fellowships. Without speaking for CalHFA, it was my impression that they're very excited, at least in part because they really wanted to bolster the early career enthusiasm and ultimately, hopefully, the pipeline for foreclosure prevention legal aid and similar home preservation legal aid, because the scope of services goes beyond pure foreclosure prevention, but that broader category of legal aid. Of course, the State Bar and Legal Services Commission are always looking at how to broaden the pipeline for legal aid more generally. And there was a real there here because the CalHFA saw that the Legal Services Trust Fund Commission has experience administering fellowship funding for legal aid. There was the PLL grants a few years ago, and now there's the Legal Aid Leaders Fellowship grants. So Mara has very expertly designed the RFP to take the best parts of all those worlds and merge them into one RFP, which I don't think we've ever seen before in this fashion, right? Because we had the standalone PLL grants and we have the standalone Legal Aid Leaders Fellowship grants, but here we have a grant that's one you're more used to seeing, an RFP you're most used to seeing for services that's more like substantive law being paired and synthesized with one that's more pipeline in its goal. And I just think that's a really exciting union. And Mara, gets all the kudos for kind of bringing that together. So Mara, I just wanted to sing your praises on that before you moved on to the application.
Well, it's very generous of you, Chris, and I hope applicants are enthusiastic about this opportunity. We do really hope that it will help to add to the pipeline of future attorneys entering the profession in legal aid. So in terms of the application proponents, the project aspect is designed in a way that is a bit more, I'll say, recognizable or similar to our other RFPs that have been project focused. We have a project profile component, which will request high-level information about the geographic focus, budget, funding status, and then an abstract of the project. The project description portion of the application will request information that specifically address the needs, target clients, any partnerships that may be a part of the project, goals, activities and deliverables that would help to meet those goals, and then strategies for outreach, accessibility, and evaluation. If the applicant is applying for a fellowship, they will also be asked to provide information about the recruitment process, the selection, integration, and career development paths for the fellowship. In terms of the proposed budget, again, there will be specific information about the project component and then the fellowship component, if applicable. For the project component, the allocation plans and estimates, the methodology by which they reach those estimates, and then supporting narratives for each one of those components. For the fellowship part of the application, line item information for the fellows, and this is where we would confirm that the salary and benefit rates that they are proposing meet their organization policies and ensure equitable entry-level pay for fellows. Last but not least, there are the project assurances and fellowship assurances, which will be a part of the application. Next slide. The project scoring definitions are in 4 parts. Each one of the criteria on the rubric will be scored as either not addressed, below expectation, meets expectations, or exceeds expectations, with a different numerical value assigned to each one of those statuses across the rubric. So the definitions are fairly straightforward. If the subject is not addressed, it does not appear, there is no response. Below expectation, it doesn't meet the expectations that we hold for whichever criteria we are looking at. Meets expectations, by definition, it addresses all of the components that we ask for on the application. Exceeds would be something exceptional that we believe really exceeds our expectations of what we were hoping to find in an applicant response. Next slide.
Is it accurate to say, Mara, that we didn't really change these definitions? These are
These
the
definitions
same
are-
definitions almost every RFP has used for at least the last couple of years. I'm sorry, I can't remember like exactly when we authored these, but I don't really think these have changed much over time. So we didn't tinker with these, right? Okay.
No, the number, the scores on the rubric are really what are different for this particular application. So on this application, impact receives 30 points, or up to 30 points, I should say. Administration and evaluation receive 15 points each. And you can see the exceeds to not address spanning as responses across the top of the rubric. So project description, this would be a 60-point max for this particular portion of the rubric. Next slide, we have our funding preferences. And the funding preferences include applications where the project has a focus on serving victims of natural disasters and either demonstrates a history of doing so or demonstrates that they are in a process currently of developing that expertise. And this is a special funding preference that is incorporated specifically into this grant. And it is, as far as I am aware, unique to this grant. I don't know if this has been a funding preference we've included before. Chris might be able to speak to that.
Sorry, it went back on. I don't know how that happened. Which one? Natural disasters or underserved communities?
Yes, victims of natural disasters. Yes.
That's I think that's unique to this RFP, and that was CalHFA's preference that we include that. The preference points for, or category rather, for prioritizing underserved communities, that one goes back many RFPs. Maybe back to one of the earlier HP grants. But the victims of natural disasters, that was CalHFA asked us to include that.
So those are the 2 funding preferences for this grant, adding weight to projects that have a focus in either of those areas. Next slide. So on a whole, the scoring rubric will be used as a guide to evaluate and discuss the applications. High scores do not guarantee funding, and the commission does maintain discretion in their funding decisions. There's a total of 85 points possible. So the breakdown is 60 points for project description, 25 for funding preferences. And the final scores will be reported back as both raw scores and as a percentage. So the percentage of the total scores will be included when we report back the scoring of these applications. The fellowship component is, as I mentioned before, separate from the project component of this application. So in terms of funding eligibility for the fellowship, those applicants that are proposing to include law school fellowships as a part of this application will need to have projects that have scored at least meets expectations for each of the general criteria, so impact, administration, and evaluation. Once they have scored and meet expectations for their project proposal in those 3 areas, the question will then be asked by the scoring team as we go through, have they demonstrated comprehensively and meaningfully strategies for recruitment and selection of qualified fellows, the integration of the fellows into the legal work and their projects, and opportunities for career development and professional growth in legal aid. And the reason behind this is we want to make sure that they are thoughtfully recruiting and selecting fellows. We want to ensure that the fellows' experience is meaningful and applied, that they're being integrated into the office, not just in terms of this particular project work, but as into the office as a whole. And that this really is serving as a launching pad for individuals to be able to start a career in legal aid. So that's the rationale behind these funding requirements and the way in which this component of the application will be assessed. Again, meeting these requirements does not guarantee funding, and the commission will maintain discretion in funding decisions. Next slide.
Mara, would you mind taking a second to describe the extent to which these requirements for the optional fellowship piece are similar to or different than the Legal Aid Leaders Fellowship or the PLL grant? Or like to what extent we like pulled from those versus decided to do this differently?
Sure. So the biggest difference is that these do not have numbered rubrics. And I believe that was at the request of CalHFA that the fellowship component not be a part of the scored rubric, but that we take a more, shall I say, less quantitative, more substantive approach in the way that the program is creating the fellowship and the impact that that fellowship is going to have. For legal aid leaders, we assess everything using a rubric, and different components have rubric scores. However, the components that we look at when we are scoring legal aid leaders are very similar to the components we're looking at here. So we assess the recruitment strategy, we assess integration, we assess career development and networking opportunities, but we do so within more of a numbered, quantified structure. So this takes a slightly different build out of a very similar idea as legal aid leaders uses. For PLL, there was also a numbered rubric, and it did look at the possibility of using that fellowship opportunity as a launching pad for individuals into legal aid, and it took into account integration and recruitment as well. So this does reflect the way that we have considered other fellowship opportunities. It's just structured slightly differently.
If I remember correctly, one of the reasons the CalHFA and our office shied away from giving points for going the fellowship route was to avoid disadvantaging more rural programs that might have more struggle, might have a harder time recruiting fellows to come work for multiple years in rural areas, even though we wanted to incentivize that with by raising the budget ceiling, saying you can ask for more money to do it than you would otherwise be able to ask for, but not penalize them in the rubric. So the score they get is going to be just sort of based on the merits of the underlying project. But they can get more money for having fellows if they want to try and recruit fellows. Thank
This
you,
also-
Mara, for indulging that.
No, I appreciate that. I think it's an important, I mean, this is unique. I don't know that we have done this necessarily, had a broken out component of an application that doesn't have a numerical score in this way. But I do think one of the advantages of this is it doesn't disadvantage programs that aren't applying for the fellowship funding, in that it doesn't affect their final score. So they can still get full funding for a project that is very well designed and is going to be incredibly impactful to the communities, even though they don't have the infrastructure to support a fellowship program. So it provides an opportunity without penalizing organizations that may not be able to take advantage of that opportunity, I think is a good way to think about it.
Ooh, and you're saying the words infrastructure for a fellowship program jogged an idea, which was the excuse me, the up to 8% available for the state bar's administrative costs, but like Mara said, if we don't use it all, it'll go to services, is supposed to support, at least in part, state bar administered or contracted, but currently the plan is to administer programming for fellows. So that the state bar can help. So if not each grantee has to stand up the infrastructure to give it all, find trainings for each of its fellows, but maybe the state bar can help with things like networking with internetworking between the fellows and trainings for them on substantive topics and stuff. So we will be using some of the admin funds to support that.
Yes, thank you.
Sorry, I didn't mean to keep you on this slide longer than you had meant to, so
No,
I'll move on for you.
It's a beautiful slide, and I also think it's a really important topic. In terms of reporting requirements, there will be semi-annual expenditure reports and services case reports that we will request from all grantees. The expenditure reports will include the actual expenditures. Services and case reports will include client service numbers, benefits reporting, the geographic and demographic data, which will be de-identified and aggregated, but we will be requesting from grantees, the economic benefits and impacts, and then the service level data as they move through their project. In terms of fellowship specific reporting, we are going to be administering a few surveys, and the surveys are going to be directed both at the fellows and at their supervisors, so that we get kind of a well-rounded and full picture about the way the fellowship has run and the impacts of that fellowship. We'll also be requesting information about the supervision practices, professional development activities, and contributions made to the organization's capacity and their capacity on that project, as well as summary of services provided directly by the fellows. So we really hope to gather a fair amount of information about what the impact of these fellowships were on the projects. And the hope is that we'll be able to use that kind of information to advocate for other fellowship opportunities in the future, because we do believe that this is a viable path of increasing the pipeline of individuals moving into the legal aid profession. A final evaluation report will occur at the end of the grant in 2029, so just around the corner. Service impact assessment, evaluation, reports and publications, whether or not the project is going to continue after the end of this grant, the impact of the work and any materials that were produced and shared, training and support activities that were not previously reported to us as part of the semi-annual reports. And then for support centers, we will ask for data regarding the quantitative and qualitative trainings, convenings, research, and other QLSP support that they provide throughout the course of this grant. Next slide.
I'll just add here that this is an opportunity for me to just note that the State Bar and CalHFA are very, very close to finalizing the contract to administer this, but they know that we're poised to release the RFP hopefully next week and an application, and they're really keen to minimize the gap between CalHFA 1 and CalHFA 2. So I'll say that it's already contemplated by all parties now that the reporting like cadence is now, semi-annual has been agreed upon. It was quarterly for CalHFA 1, so I'm hoping that will be a little bit less of a reporting burden for the CalHFA 2 programs.
And quasi on that note, the proposed grant timeline would be that we would release the RFP and applications in Smart Simple next Tuesday. Applications would then be due on September 19th. We would proceed to score the applications between September 19th and October 21st. And then we will bring funding recommendations to the PDI committee at, I believe, your next meeting on October 24th. With the hope that these recommendations would be taken to the Legal Services Trust Fund Commission on November 7th. The grant period would then begin on December 1st, and grantees would be able to report expenditures and services retroactive to July 1, which, to Chris's point, meets the hope that there will be a minimal gap between the end of the 2022-2025 CalHFA grant and this new funding opportunity. I also want to highlight that we will be hosting a webinar for applicants and potential grantees, and that webinar will occur on Wednesday, September 3rd. No, Thursday. Never speak off the cuff regarding specific.
Mid next week.
Next week.
Yes.
The announcement was sent out, and we will be hosting that webinar to answer questions and provide information to grantees. And as soon as I can get my cursor to actually click on the place on the screen where it is not, which seems to be the issue.
It is Wednesday,
Is there,
September 3rd. And thank you to a colleague for confirming that for me.
Thank you very much. So that is our proposed grant timeline.
So it is functionally, it can be up to a 4-year spending and services period. Mara had on an earlier slide that according to the grant agreement that the programs would sign, it'll be approximately 3.5 years because we wanted the grant period to start after the commission approves the award, but consistent with how the commission has administered other grants, including CalHFA 1, we can have the agreement explicitly allow for retroactive spending and services. And so CalHFA was supportive of going back all the way to July 1. So it can be a 4-year period and perfectly line up with the end of the CalHFA 1 grant.
We very much appreciate that opportunity.
Since the next slide is the resolution, I can maybe I can stop sharing my screen if you would like to lead everyone through a discussion, Mara, or if anyone wants me to, I can continue to share my screen in case anyone wants to go back and look at something.
Yeah, if you could keep the slides up, that would be just in case somebody has a specific question.
I only accidentally stopped sharing my screen. I will bring them back up.
It's okay. I'm dealing with a ghost computer, so. Hi, Kenneth.
Okay. Does anyone have questions for Mara about this? Thank you, Mara, for the excellent slides that you weren't able to share yourself, but we got to see anyway. And for all of the work, hopefully commissioners got a chance to see your very detailed RFP that was attached to our agenda. Does anyone have questions? I see Ken's hand. Ken.
Okay, so thank you, Mara, for that presentation. I have to tell you, before the presentation, I wasn't all that excited. I was very excited about the inclusion of the various features concerning fellowships, both the requirements for applicants and the things that were going to be done for fellows. I think that's very important. I wasn't that excited about carving out a separate pool of money for it. it seemed to me that you could include that money in the main pool, but that you could also include those fellowship features and make that part of the overall program. I understand from your presentation that some of this was dictated or suggested by CalHFA in the negotiations between the State Bar and CalHFA, and I understand the idea between separately scoring the fellowship proposal and not putting the rubric with respect to the fellowship proposals. And I think that makes sense. And so my concerns about having the separate pool of money aren't the same that I had before your presentation. I do have one question about one of the CalHFA suggestions, and that was the inclusion of in the rubric for the project disaster assistance. And I'm wondering, you have in the proposal that it's going to get a maximum of 15 points, whereas the underserved communities only gets 10 points maximum. I'm wondering why that was the choice made to have victims of natural disasters at a higher level. It's not hard for me to imagine that a natural disaster could occur that would have no impact, although a terrible natural disaster, it would have no impact on home ownership or any of the things that CalHFA is focused on. And it seems to me that while including natural disasters, given the prevalence of natural disasters in our state and the likelihood of more in the future, it makes sense to include it. I'm just wondering why it was given 15 points versus underserved communities, which underserved communities, that applies to almost every applicant that you're going to get in, I would think. And so it just seemed to me to be a mismatch between priorities between those two.
And I completely understand and appreciate your question. I think having thought through the math of this and also thinking about the overlap, what we really are doing by providing the 15 points to victims of natural disaster as well as 10 points to underserved communities is there's a very high likelihood of intersectionality. And so I don't think, although there is a separation between those categories on the rubric, that in reality, when it comes to the effects of natural disasters on communities, that there's much of a separation at all. I think that when organizations are focused on underserved communities and thinking about the ways in which that community might be affected by natural disasters, those organizations would essentially be receiving up to 25 points. We could make it a more even distribution, but I don't think that the points that would necessarily be that meaningful necessarily because of the intersectionality. So it's a very small difference in points. I think in terms of percentage, it's a 5% difference between the two. But because of the intersectionality, I actually think organizations that are focused on victims of natural disaster will likely also have a component of focusing on underserved communities. So I think we will see an overlap in those areas, if that makes sense.
Got it. Yeah, it does. It does. One last thing. I think you have a typo in attachment A of the RFP. You have several bullet points. It's actually on page 12 of the PDF. There's a bullet point that talks about underserved communities, and the word that's there in the first line is fellows, and it should be instead of fellows, I think it should be project, or yeah, it should be project instead of fellows, because it's under the section talking about project, not under the fellowship section. And I think that word ought to be changed.
I appreciate you flagging that. I don't know if Chris or perhaps Danielle could pull up that document, as I do not have a functional cursor at the moment.
I could pull it up. We
appreciate
can also, it's my understanding, well, by the way, really quick, actually, but I was writing it down. Ken, what was the page number?
So it's page number 12 of the PDF, and it's in attachment A. And it's under the section of attachment A, right after the scoring rubric is set out in a table. And there are bullet points for each of the scoring rubric elements, impact, administration, and so on. And under the bullet point for underserved communities, it refers to the fellows, and it should be the project.
Great. And for the purposes of approving the RFP, generally, historically, State Bar staff can make like a technical copy edit style correction if it's not substantive. So what we'll do is when Erin is like asking her question, I'm going to pull it up and see if it looks really substantive, in which case we might want to just flag it in the resolution. But if it's just like a really kind of benign typo, we can probably just make it before we release
I
it.
think
Yeah.
it's a copy edit, benign type typo.
Perfect. I'll pull it up and take a look, but thank you for flagging that. Yeah. Erin? Sorry, Erin, we
Oh, sorry, I
hear you.
wasn't unmuted.
Okay.
I made a joke, but it's too late.
No, it won't be funny anymore. You could try again.
It's okay. Thank you very much, Mara and Chris, for this presentation. I really appreciate all the clearly very hard and thoughtful work that you've put into this. And I think overall it looks really great. And I'm very excited about the fellowship piece as well. I have a number of questions, but I'm gonna start with 3 if I could, and then see if we have time to get to some of my others. Some of them are more like clarifications or possibly like smaller corrections in the RFP that could potentially be done later. But so 3 that I would love to discuss. On the fellowship piece, I noticed the requirement that the maximum duration of the fellowships will be 2 years. And I'm wondering if you can talk about the thinking behind that. My first thought was, why not the full duration of the project, which by the time they're able to post and hire for a fellow might be about 3 years. And so it just kind of, I think, creates maybe like a turnover difficulty, like hiring and retention and turnover difficulty for both the organizations and the fellows alike. So I'm wondering if you could talk about that. If I could say my 3 questions, and I'm happy to repeat them, and you can decide which order you want to take them in. My second and third questions are about the scoring rubric itself. First, on the points given for evaluation systems, I'm wondering, with the 30 points for kind of the substance of the program, the impact, and then essentially like 30 points between administration and evaluation for like the administration of it. To me, that seems a little to weight the administrative components more than the substantive work. And especially on the evaluation, I was just curious about the thinking there. I mean, I know that it can be very difficult for individual organizations to like come up with elaborate evaluation schemes or hire external evaluators or any sort of like really extensive evaluation work. And I would hate to see that be a reason, why something doesn't score as well. So I my gut is that those points could maybe be lowered and the impact points could be increased or something like that, to kind of put the substance of the work weighted a little more heavily. And then my third point, and this is kind of more of a big picture 30,000 foot point, but it may need to kind of boil down to numbers. In the RFP, there's some really great language that and in the memo actually, that I really agree with about, wanting to distribute grants statewide and to fund a diversity of projects serving, diverse range of geographic areas and substantive issues and client constituencies. So I love that. And I do think that is a great kind of overarching goal. And it's not apparent to me how in this scoring rubric we would go about that. At what point are there, could extra points be assigned for that? Or, is that going to be able to be taken into account? So thank you for indulging my 3 long questions.
No, I appreciate it. Thank you very much, Erin. I'm going to just take them in order, if that's okay with you. So in terms of your question regarding the fellowships, the rationale for the 2-year limit, and it is an upward limit, they can choose to have a shorter fellowship if they prefer, partially takes into account the goal of including fellowships as a part of this grant, which is to try to increase the pipeline. And by providing fellowships of up to 2 years, we are encouraging turnover. We are encouraging organizations to hire like at least 1 round, if not 2, of fellows. They can also identify fellows that are already working with them, but that they now want to fund through this grant to support this particular project. There are different ways that we think organizations could tackle this question, but that was the goal, was really to try to optimize the effects on the pipeline of individuals entering the legal aid community. In terms of onboarding, recruiting, etc., the term of the fellowship would only be once they are hired. So it wouldn't include like the time spent to recruit, if that makes any sense. I don't know if that answers your question about the thought process on that limit.
Yeah, I mean, I think the core of what I hear you saying is to basically try to get more people in the pipeline, to actually
Yes.
encourage turnover and include more humans. I'm wondering if the legal aid community has given any feedback or thoughts on this. I mean, do they agree that this is the best way to go about it, or would it be easier for everyone and possibly even further the goal of enabling people to launch a career in this area if could be like a 3-year job instead of a 2-year job?
We haven't heard yet from our 2 liaisons who often share their expertise on like what might be helpful to legal aid. Yay, Selena and Zach, you know who you are. But I will say, actually, I will answer one question real quick, which is Erin. We did run a draft of the RFP by the National Housing Law Project because they were so involved in securing the funds. So we especially wanted to make sure that like the scope of services and whatnot felt right to them too. I can't remember if they offered any feedback on that particular, the fellowships of up to 2 years piece, but there was one legal aid grantee that we did run it by. But yeah, Selena raised your hand.
We talked a little bit about this idea, but I don't think anyone said that they had a preference for 2 years versus 3 years. It was just not an issue. I do know that CalHFA and many others felt it was really important to incentivize pipeline issues for the long-term needs of having more attorneys with these skills. So I don't know who selected the 2 years, but I didn't hear anyone say they had an issue with that. And I think a lot of fellowships are either the like bridge fellowships, like post-graduation, like PLL kind of things, or the more traditional fellowships are 2-year fellowships.
Thanks, Selena. That's helpful. I mean, if the service providers don't have a problem with it, then I don't either. I just wanted to raise it as.
No, I appreciate the question, as these numbers are not arbitrarily placed within the RFP, and it's important that conversation occurs back and forth regarding them. To that point, your question about the scoring rubric and the breakdown between impact, administration, and evaluation. The reason for the numbers that we landed on in this case is partially because evaluation is a part of impact. And so even though it appears to have a small number and impact has a larger number, albeit like, impact appears to be equally weighted along with administration and evaluation, it's very difficult to actually separate these 3 things when you are reading an application, because the way our applications are structured, we don't have one question that says, please address impact, please address administration, please address evaluation. It's much more nuanced than that, and there's a lot more that goes into this application process. And so the way that this has been broken down, it allows for organizations that maybe don't have the ability to create, as you put it, like, you know, to hire an external contractor to go and design surveys and, you know, run a complex analysis of data. But there may be other ways that they evaluate the ongoing impact of their project, because the overall hope and the reason why these three components are important to our grants, and particularly a grant that's 4 years long, is to be able to demonstrate or look at an organization's plans to assess the impact and the ongoing success of the project year over year. And the hope would be that the evaluation is occurring throughout the course of the grant, which is why it's so important. But we don't want to disadvantage smaller organizations by giving the evaluation component itself a huge number on the rubric, if that makes sense. So the assessment and the evaluation of the applications using this rubric, I won't say it's entirely case by case, but different programs, depending on the size of the programs, may have different capacities to demonstrate what they will do to evaluate. And also different projects of different sizes are going to have different approaches towards evaluation. So the components are important, and they're weighted that way to acknowledge their importance, to acknowledge that there's overlap between those components, but still to weight the impact of the project most heavily. So I hope that makes sense and answers your question.
Can I jump in on this one too? Mara did a very nice job of sort of describing how the categories relate from a points perspective. So the committee does have, and this actually gets back to one of Ken's questions, does have absolute, like if there was any doubt, the prerogative to sort of spread the points differently. I'll only just say, and maybe everyone remembers this, but these three categories, well, we can adjust the point spread. The State Bar rules generally require the rule that requires an RFP for competitive grants, that we keep these three categories: impact, administration, evaluation, but it doesn't say like exactly how many points they need to get for the different levels of performance.
Thanks for clarifying that, both of you. And I mean, just for sort of the sake of, you know, a thought exercise, like it's so, if I'm hearing you correctly, Chris, there's no sort of fundamental reason why we couldn't consider like moving 5 points from evaluation to impact. So it's 35 and 10 or something like that. That's within the scope of our sort of authority.
Yes, yeah. The committee can do that. Committees have done that, moved points around a little bit, made a one category, maybe two categories that look like they were equally weighted, not be equally weighted, or vice versa. The only thing I'll say is this spread, Mara, correct me if this is wrong, this is likely the same spread of points for these three categories that we had in the CalHFA 1 rubric. Is that right? I don't think we changed it.
I could not speak to that actually.
Okay, so we maybe not. So take that back. Okay, we usually take the most recent rubric when we're like, you know, when a new funding source comes along, we take the most recent one and reuse it, or only make like very like kind of necessary refinements to it, and then assume that any additional refinements will be at the discretion of the relevant committee. Like staff doesn't really tinker with it. So so there's a good chance this is very similar to what was in CalHFA 1, but committees have moved points around in the rubric to emphasize or de-emphasize different criteria.
Chris, is there a way we can check that? Because that was going to be my question.
Yeah, I can. I go find the
follow up.
CalHFA 1 RFP. Yeah, I can go find it. Yeah.
Chris, I just
Just
pulled
to
it
make sure
up.
it was the same
Oh,
scoring rubric.
Danielle, you're new.
Yes.
You're incoming committee coordinator.
Sorry to jump in, but I just found it quickly. So we had a category called Project Impact that was 30 points, administration was 20, and then evaluation was 15, in addition to some other categories related to socially disadvantaged populations and outreach strategies. So evaluation was slightly lower compared to administration, but based on what we have now, the only one that's different actually is administration was higher in the past.
Thank you for already having that ready to go, Danielle.
Appreciate that, Danielle.
So Erin, I don't know what your thoughts are on, with the points spread. I know you had a third question, which we haven't gotten to
I
yet.
did,
But
yeah, and I'm curious to hear what, the other commissioners and folks think about this evaluation point. So I don't want to, hold us up on that necessarily myself.
Vanessa. Was that, did all three of Aaron's questions get answered? I think that.
Aaron has one more question,
Okay.
but I see Vanetta raised.
Well, that's why I was asking, because I see Vanetta's hands. Vanetta, you had thoughts.
Oh, hi. Just want to respond on the Aaron's question about evaluation. Obviously, I think evaluation is critical to any program development. And I think what's happened in the past, speaking of the original fellowship program, at one point it was new. It's a pilot. It didn't have a strong evaluation piece. But what we found, oh, Christy, you're on the same committee. What we found is that over time, when they incorporated evaluations, it made for a stronger program down the road. And perhaps that's what's contributed to it getting additional funding over time. So I think that the absence of evaluation would be a deal breaker. But the variance on points, I think, might be kind of semantics. I think if some organizations may not have the infrastructure, but if we encourage them or emphasize the importance of it, they can build that in over time, and then perhaps get more support over the training, from the training experts. I think the evaluation is a critical point. Oftentimes organizations don't have the infrastructure at the onset, but they may be able to develop that over time.
Yeah,
Thank
I
you.
was on that with you too, Vanetta. So I understand what you're saying as well.
That's great. Thank you very much for that feedback.
So
So
feel free, Aaron, if you wanted to propose, or anybody else, a proposal like slightly different, I'd make administration evaluation the same again, or like Danielle was saying, actually, administration was a
administration
little
had more
heavierly
points.
weighted last time, or, feel free before we get to the resolution stage. But Aaron, I also didn't want to lose your third question.
Yeah, I like to get to that. No, based on Vanetta, thank you for your comments, and Judge Rossi, I wouldn't make a proposal to change the evaluation points at this point.
Okay. And then Mara, do you remember Aaron's third question? Do you want Aaron to restate it?
I was just going to reiterate it back to you and make sure that I am recalling it correctly. So your third question was regarding the use of the term diversity as it relates to geographic diversity and basically like diversity of services across the project. Is that accurate, and how that is actually assessed when we're using the rubric?
It's more to the how to match kind of the stated goal of the overall funding stream as stated in the memo and the RFP to fund a wide range of geographic areas, client constituencies, and there's a third, I think, just programs. How you might think that's captured in the scoring rubric now, or if it's not, how it might be.
So it is partially captured in the scoring rubric, but I will also say that a part of the answer to your question is, I don't want to say necessarily we don't know yet, but we don't necessarily know the solution yet because we don't have applications in front of us yet. So a part of the solution and the answer to that goal depends on the kinds of applications that we receive. So in an entirely hypothetical world, if we received applications and they were all from one county, which I don't know that would ever happen, but the definition of funding diverse focuses in geographical areas would look really different than, if we had applications that equally represented every part of the state. So a part of addressing the funding goals, as stated in the RFP, really depends on the applications that we receive. And I believe that is where discretion and the discretion retained by the commission regarding funding recommendations can come into play, where we will score based off of the rubric. We will look at the design of the projects, on the funding preferences, on the integration potentially of fellows, and we will design more than one funding recommendation. And then that funding recommendation will be brought and discussed keeping in mind the goals of funding diversely and widely across the state. So
So-
unfortunately, I don't have a very neat answer to that
Well,
question.
I can offer a specific example that is
That would be
in
great.
line with what you just described. Like, because the way you described it was perfect. And I think Danielle, you led the scoring process for CalHFA 1 back in 2022. So I just had the pleasure of observing it. I think there was a moment where that clause got used. The committee availed itself of that clause, so to speak, because it was looking like there was going to be a large number of projects like Mara was just describing could happen in one county or in a cluster of counties. And then there was a couple of projects that they were like 1 point off or like 1 point lower on the rubric, but the money was running out and they all served rural counties that otherwise weren't going to get a project. And so I think what might have happened for CalHFA 1's scoring team availed itself of the opportunity to recommend a more geographically diverse spread of funds by essentially, like, after funding like the 6th project for a particular county, they jumped down and started funding counties that weren't going to get anything, or projects that were going to serve counties that wouldn't get one.
Yeah,
It's not that common, but I've seen it happen a couple times, and that it's that sentence that lets you do it.
yeah, that's exactly the type of scenario I'm thinking of, Chris. And I certainly, you know, I know everyone is always very well-meaning and thoughtful and, you know, doing great work, but I personally feel like it's important to memorialize it a little more than in good intentions, and like that hopefully someone's going to remember that the RFP makes that overarching statement, and then we're going to remember it later. Like, so I think that it might be helpful to have a reminder or a trigger at the end, as we're building out the, you know, different scenarios for funding recommendations. I don't know if it's 5 extra points or if it's, you know, I don't know, like, mechanically what it might look like, but I personally would like to see something built into the structure to make sure that that goal is, you know, gonna come to fruition, basically.
So I have a thought on that too, and maybe what I'm going to say is what Dwan's going to say, and I see your hand, Dwan, but I'm going to jump in front of you if that's okay, real quick. So in scoring these types of things in the past, I always thought or took into consideration or considered that section on underserved communities at the end where we have, you know, where it talks about underserved communities, and I always, you know, read that as a community, a rural community doesn't have, you know, to Chris's point of there's not 6 legal aid organizations serving that county doing that kind of work, that actually is the kind of thing that pushes it from a 10 to a 15, right? That is that, to Aaron's point of 5 extra points, maybe it meets expectations, but if it's in another county where there's no one else doing this work, that maybe that actually is the bump. And that makes that one exceeds expectations. That is the extra 5 points that they get, and that's built into the rubric under the underserved community. That's always how I had sort of envisioned it. Just, you know, because I hear Aaron's point of, like, you know, everyone's well-intentioned, but I always read that as that's what put it into exceeds expectations, because it is truly an underserved community. I don't know if that helps Aaron at all, but I'm throwing that in for what it's worth. And Dwan maybe is going to say something even better than what I just said. Hopefully she
I'm
will.
just going to provide some historical information, because there used to be, when I did it, like the development of the rubric, there used to be a line in kind of the RFP that said, and I don't know why it got taken out, or maybe it's still in there and I can't recall, like the commission like retains authority to pretty much fund, not because you're scoring, but we'll take in consideration a diversity of programs based on geography, client community, so pretty much giving you discretion to kind of move things around. And then I think that we got some feedback over the years from programs that felt a little bit like unfair if they scored above the cut score, and then it felt like you guys are just pulling them up. So then what we did, and I actually think this was like a pretty good solution. One of the things I did to kind of account for that, or we did to account for that, is that impact category that Erin you mentioned is a little bit low now. It actually used to be like higher in some iterations of other RFPs, where it would be like sometimes 50 points or 60 points, and then you would build it be more explicit and build it into that category, and then that would be where you get the bump. So then at the end of the day, when you go to post it, I mean, effectively is the same, but I think it's maybe an easier pill for grantees to see their score, and that it wasn't this post. It didn't happen post scoring because they would have got it, but it's just it just gets accounted in within the scoring to make it again both transparent and then to give you that discretion. And I did make this observation to the staff that I was building out this RFP that, you know, how come it's like 85 and not 100 points? And they have said to me over the last years, and I think maybe with the last CalHFA it was out of 85, so they wanted to keep it consistent. However, if you guys choose to kind of like go in a different direction, that could be where you might want to, again, scale it up to 100 and then put 15 points more into the impact. That might address your concerns, Erin, about impact. That would certainly please me if that category went up a little bit higher. And then we might want to build in something to be more explicit in the rubric itself. That might get at all the concerns. It does. You won't have the consistency piece. I think the existing staff feel really strongly about, but that might get at like the various concerns now. Just a thought on that historical piece.
That's really helpful. And Judge Rosie, your comment is as well. And this is so hard because I totally agree. You know, transparency to the grantees is very important. I can see how both of those options that you mentioned could be possible. I think what's hard about them though is then the scorers are, well, so the grantees don't know who else is going to apply, right? So, you know, they can't say we're going to be the only project in this county or serving this client population because they don't know who else is going to apply, let alone get funded. And at the same time, the scorers also don't know, right? So like to your point, Judge Rosie, about underserved communities, I think rural is maybe more easy, but because, you know, county's rural or it's not, but we don't know until the end, right? Like if a certain client population is going to be completely left out just based on the scoring. So when you're doing the underserved, you don't know if they're underserved yet because you don't know who else is going to get funded. You know what I mean? So I'm just trying to figure out how to both, you know, do a transparent process in real time based on the applications and looking at the funding as a whole, you know, give life to that goal of true sort of statewide coverage.
Well, to clarify,
gonna solve
just
it.
quick, and I don't mean to, no, I don't mean to interrupt anyone, but just to clarify really quick, the underserved component is not underserved in the world of applications. The underserved is in the community at large. So focusing on an underserved community does not relate to the applications we receive. Focusing on an underserved community would be historically underserved within our state, and an explanation of how that community faces obstacles that are greater than just being below a certain income level. So just to clarify, like that category is separate from what applications are received.
Thanks, Mark. Selena wants to shed light as well.
I'm happy with the history of underserved because it's like a made up. When we were asking the state to fund various grants, homelessness preventions, the Assembly and Senate committees at the time, judiciary committees at the time, each had priorities that they really wanted to make sure that funding went to support either rural nonprofits that were underfunded or to organizations that served immigrants that needed more funds in order to increase services to immigrants. And so it used to say that served rural organizations or immigrants regardless of status, but in prior presidencies, the legislature removed that. And so underserved historically meant people who had a more difficult time getting services because of their immigration status. So that's the history, but it is just a made up word. Underserved. Everybody's underserved.
Thank you.
Thanks, Selena.
I mean, is it is it, I guess I can make whatever proposal I want, but if I were to make this proposal, would this cause, I guess, administrative problems for the staff to like add, and I don't know how this would work because it would have to be, I guess, 2 phases to the scoring process, but we could build that into the process. So applications scored as presented.
Yeah.
And then when the scoring committee looks at the, what we have based on how many we get and if everyone's getting funded or not, maybe like an additional 5 points for furthering that stated goal, right? Which I have, I copied it out of the RFP. It's but to enable the commission to make its best effort to distribute grants statewide and fund a diversity of high impact projects. And so you could get like 5 points if it furthers that goal.
The
Let me ask you this. Well, 2 things, I guess. I don't know that we have the time to add more rounds of scoring because it's a really tight timeline, but do we have to, let me ask, and I'll ask, Dwan or Chris or someone, Danielle, do we have to add, I hear what Aaron's saying about, wanting to boost, but the way I read the RFP and the way I read what the scoring committee has the authority to do we have to add 5 points? Because it sounds like we have discretion even if to move stuff around without saying you get 5 more points.
That was I was gonna say.
No, but that's not gonna feel good. This is the stakeholder piece of it. That's what I'm saying. That it's not gonna feel good to grantees once you go.
Sure.
Then to find later on that you moved around because of that. That's why I do think if you're gonna exercise that, I think build it into the scoring rubric.
Build it into the rubric.
Yeah, but Aaron, let me ask you this, just so I can understand why wouldn't you just do it, like if you wanted to give the 5 point bump, why can't you just do it during the score? Like, I guess you're thinking about, because you got to, it's relative to everybody else.
Yeah, exactly.
That's what I was saying in the beginning is, can you just, this, for me, that it was the difference between meets expectations and exceeds. Because that is a 5 or 10 more bump, but.
Yeah, I mean, it's more like that you don't know what you have until the end, and, that just, not to get into the partnership grant thing, but we had like the one project in the one area didn't get funded and a lot of other projects that got funded. And so like, is there any way structurally to at least recognize that and think about, is that the ultimate outcome that we want or not in terms of this stated goal?
So kind of getting at like what I think Dawn was talking about, there's like 2 ways the committee could take. One is add another row, and just the scoring team has to go back and like do that row at the end after they've read everything, which is what I think you're describing, Aaron. And then there's the tech that I think that I've seen scoring teams take in the past, which was just do like after they've read through them all, kind of do a quick. They don't go back necessarily discuss every single application again as much detail, but they'll do like a last pass for that, like they'll calibrate to themselves kind of thing and be like, now that we've read them all, do we actually think that like this point spreads was relative to one another what we want it to be before we send these recommendations to the committee, and they'll adjust. And it's not an additional row of the rubric, formally speaking, but they'll adjust their scores now that they've read all the proposals and they have them all in like the back of their minds. I think either one, depending on how it's implemented, could achieve that goal. Adding a row to the rubric might be like a more structurally like guaranteed to happen in a particular way, but I think in the past scoring teams have kind of found a way to do that by just going back and revisiting their scores and making sure they felt good about them.
Yeah, but Chris, when they did it that way, it was more like adjusting relative based on like impact. It wasn't like, I think the way you're envisioning, Aaron, in terms of like having spread for substantive areas and client feature, I think if you're actually going to do that, it should be a little bit more formal and like it should be thoughtful.
Give it a row.
It can't just be, I remember this and I think this project, that feels a little bit more tenuous to tell you the truth. If you're going to do that type of analysis where you're going to try to get statewide reach, I think you got to have the staff help you guys prepare a little bit more of a spread against geography and then whatever else this diversity, if you're thinking substantive issue, like client, like whatever, I think it needs to be a bit more organized than that.
So
I
we
think
have
it's
had
safer that
rubrics.
way.
We have had rubrics in the past. I think it was PG, at least historically, that actually gave like up to an additional 5 or so points for, fill in the blank, innovation or something like that. This could be that category for this rubric.
Yeah, and I kind of actually I think the memo expresses it possibly even better than the RFP. So because I've copied that language too. So it says to serve a diverse range of geographic areas, substantive issues, and client constituencies. With the funding overall. That's
So-
like to Juwan's point, like that's concrete,
Yeah.
transparent, measurable, I believe.
So could that be another category then?
I'm just gonna scroll up so everyone can read that if they like.
Mhm.
I think
Thank
it's
you.
right here. Is this it?
I copied and pasted it out of
No,
it.
you read it some that.
It's a little higher up in the actual memo.
Oh, it's in the
It's in-
memo.
it's
Oh,
in the
okay.
me-
Oh, not
Yeah,
the RFP.
it's in the
Okay.
actual memo.
The RFP has a slightly different articulation of that same concept, but I personally like the memo version.
So should you not hide the ball and then just put it against, if you like
It's
that ball agreement straight into either the RFP or the scoring rubric itself and make it a category?
the language Erin is referring to is on page 3 of the memo.
Thank you, Ken.
Thank you, Ken.
Yeah, consideration will also be given to ensure the funding supports projects that, as a group, serve a diverse range of geographic areas, substantive issues, and client constituencies.
There it is.
Yep, there you go.
So if I can offer a quick example, and it's a little different because this is legal aid leaders, and legal aid leaders, we're considering not only what organizations we're funding, but also how many fellows we are going to award. And I can speak to our process last year because we're addressing the same requirement and same goal. When we developed our 3 different funding possibilities, and we brought them to, at that time, the Legal Aid Leaders Committee, we basically created 3 different mathematical models and presented them in terms of, if we went strictly by scoring, here's what the distribution of fellows across the state would be. If we took into account, like, not maybe awarding 30 fellows to an organization, but instead capping the number of fellows in order to distribute the fellows more widely across the state, this is what the distribution of fellows would be. And then we had a 3rd option that took into account other ways in which we looked at the scores and the breakdown of distribution. So the reason I mention this is because with this particular grant, not only are we dealing with the project funding levels, we're also dealing with the fellowship component. And if we add in a category to the rubric, it is only going to affect the projects. And it's also going to be a step that we have to take. So if, and this could happen, like, well, I am definitely one to prepare for the possibility of the worst case scenario, but also allowing for the possibility that I may not need that plan. There is a possibility that when we score, we don't need to make that kind of an adjustment, but we would now have a line in the rubric that required us to go back and to reassess and to allocate some kind of point system, which may or may not be needed. And then we have the question of, well, now how do we address the distribution of funding with respect to fellows? So while I appreciate the idea and the thought about how do we quantifiably apply this requirement and this goal within the RFP, I wonder if by making it more structured, we may inadvertently introduce a problem that will open inconsistencies in the way that we approach funding for the projects versus funding for the fellows, as opposed to taking it as a more nuanced approach and creating the mathematical model the way we did with legal aid leaders, and then addressing it more holistically and looking at a distribution. And I don't know if that makes sense, but that's kind of my concern as we talk about this, addressing this potential issue, is whether or not we might actually be making the issue more complicated.
My, well, I want to do a time check because we're at about 1:30. I know we have at least one kind of presentation that would benefit from having as close to a half hour as possible, which is on the data one. But I feel like we're kind of close to being able to get to the resolution. And I think, like it felt to me like a moment ago, a very easy to real actualize change would be to just, because we see this in other rubrics, a row at the bottom up to 5 points, and we can just use this phrasing from the memo for that category, and it will be up to the scoring team how to interpret it. Well, I mean, ultimately, the scoring team's just going to make a recommendation to the committee and can explain how it interpreted it, and the committee can, refine that or something. But it's sort of just to capture the spirit of this sentence. Up to 5 points or 10 points or whatever feels right for projects that would help achieve the following outcome, serves a diverse range of geographic areas. And of course, that's not like super duper precisely worded, but that's almost a good thing, because then the scoring team can interpret that in the way that it thinks leads to the best policy outcome.
I'm okay with that.
I like that idea.
And we can just adjust the resolution to say,
Yeah.
Approves the RFP with the following change. The scoring rubric will have an additional row that, and then I'll copy and paste this in what it should say.
Would it also, if we're going to do that, that brings the total up to 95. Would it make sense at that point to add another 5 points to impact and make it 100, so that, because people are going to look at it and go, 95, why isn't it 100?
Oh, music to my ears, Ken. I've been saying 100, 100. That would be great.
Can I switch back to the slides, put the resolution up, and maybe start editing it a little bit so we can, okay, I'm going to do that. 1 second. I'm going to stop sharing the RFP.
Make sure you grab that first language that
I just copied and
as a
pasted it.
group.
Oh, you want as a group? Okay, great,
Yeah,
great, great.
because that's the meta. Otherwise, you
Right,
can't.
that's what Erin's been trying to
Amazing.
say.
Yeah.
All right, so
Afterwards,
I'm
we have to
gonna
look at it as a group.
share my screen. We're gonna have it in the kind of view where I can edit it.
Okay. And then Ken would be really happy if we made, and so would
And-
Dawn, it sounds like, if we made it around 100.
Amazing.
So that would mean adding an additional 10 points, not 5, because 5 extra points brings us to 90.
Oh,
Yeah.
Well, yeah, and it's whatever the committee feels is right. So
Okay.
so we have
I'm okay
resolved.
with 90.
Yeah, that the Program Development Impact Committee approves the release of the 2529 California Housing Finance Agency request grant proposals. With this is how I usually see it, with the following changes. And then we'll do, and please feel free to steer me, but I'm going to just start typing. The rubric, the scoring rubric will include an additional row that states, and then I'm going to wordsmith this. The project would help to achieve, and by all means, feel free to help to achieve the following outcome.
Yeah.
All projects as a group serve a diverse, and then that's just copy and pasted from the memo. And we'll say maybe an additional row that provides up to, do you want to do 5 points? I heard 10 points because we're going to get to 100, right?
No.
If we're doing 10 points, then we're pushing like what we're giving for.
We're
The other
currently at
stuff too,
85.
right?
So there's 15 points needed to get us to 100.
Okay, so that was, I think, Erin, does that capture
Yeah, that
your
captures
vision?
the spirit. Could I just wordsmith it super fast?
Absolutely.
I promise it won't take long because I'm just going to
Please.
go back. 5 points to the stage. The project would help to achieve, can we say would help to achieve just looking at the memo. The memo says that the funding supports projects that as a group. So like the goal of the funding supporting projects that as a group. Goal.
To achieve the goal of the funding that all projects as a group serve.
I don't think you need the all projects.
Okay.
Project would help to achieve the goal of the funding, supporting projects that there.
Amazing.
Project would help to achieve the goal, the funding supporting projects that is great. Yeah, that's right from the memo. It's a little clunky, but it's intelligible, I think.
We know what it means.
The project would help to achieve the goal of the funding, supporting projects that as a group serve a diverse range.
Um,
Do you want me to add of here,
don't-
the goal of the funding? No.
No,
I think grammatically what you have actually is correct. It's just, it works. So I think it's acceptable, but humble opinion. Now, points for impact. This gets us,
Well-
Mara, to 85 points.
this gets us to 90.
90.
90.
Right, and
So
you
we'd have to
you
add
could
10
leave
more
it at
points
90.
somewhere. I'm okay leaving it at 90 if Ken is okay with 90. It feels less yucky than 95 and to 100. I agree. Unless
Is it-
Swan really wants 100.
No, I mean, I already passed that along to the staff that they didn't want that. So I was just like, if it was 95, yeah, I think we should.
If it were
100.
95, I would feel compelled to
Yeah.
add 5 points to
I
make
just,
it 100.
and I'll just say this now since I already brought it up, because it feels to me a little odd when we have one score rubric that's like 85, another that's 100. Like your mind goes to a scale of 100 because we're used to grading in school.
Of course.
And so it's just conceptually, I think, hard.
One typo in that sentence, it should be, there you got it.
I appreciate you, Ken. The are there any other is there anything I missed?
And Ken's earlier change can be made without changing our resolution.
Yes,
correct?
we did.
'Cause
We
it's
pulled it up.
just-
Yeah, it was staff assessment. That's a copy edit,
Yeah.
and we'll fix that
Okay,
that
good.
typo that Ken pointed out about yeah, the word on page 12 it was, I think.
Yeah, great. Okay.
Amazing.
I'm good with that. Does that look the way you want it to look, Erin?
I appreciate it. Can I make a motion to adopt the resolution on the screen?
You may.
So I'll second.
Thank you, Ken.
Wonderful. So I have Commissioner Smith moving and Commissioner Babcock seconding. Alakani, absent. Babcock,
Yes.
Campbell,
Yes.
Escobedo, absent. Morales, absent. Smith,
Yes.
and Judge Rossi.
Yes.
That's 4 yeses, 0 nos, 3 absents, 0 abstentions. So motion passes. We have a
Excellent.
RFP that we can release. Thank you, everybody.
Yay, our first one.
Yes, so this is the PDI. This was it. This is the committee
Yes.
that designs new RFPs we've never seen before, and you perform that
And we just
inaugural
did something
function
no
on
one's
your
seen
inaugural
before.
RFP. So congratulations, everybody.
Congratulations, thank you.
Now,
Thank you,
Judge
Maura.
Rossi, we do have 2 presenters who I was really hoping could go today if they're still
and I know that-
available.
Yeah, I know we have to skip Kim. She had to leave.
I'd love to skip to our data team if
Yes.
if Crystal and Lisette are still available.
Okay, that's
I
fine with
think they
me.
have a really exciting
Right.
presentation.
Okay, good. Sorry, Danielle, we're skipping you too.
That is quite all right. If we have time at the end, I'm happy to do it. And if not, I can chat about it in October. Not a big deal.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. Hi, Crystal. Hi, Lisette.
Hello.
Nice to see you both.
In the interest of time, I'll go ahead and get started. It looks like hopefully my video is not too laggy. Let me go ahead and share screen. Okay, can everyone see this? This is agenda item 4.4. update regarding the legal aid data project. Just checking. Sorry, Judge Rosie, I see your mouth speaking, but I don't hear you. I don't know if you're on mute. Okay. Okay. Should I go ahead and get started? Sorry about that. I'm like having audio issues. I don't know if I'm not hearing folks. Okay. Okay, wonderful. So Lizen and I will be presenting an update on the legal aid data project. I know that was a very thorough conversation you all had about the previous agenda item, so hopefully this will be equally as engaging. Plan for today, we're just going to give an update of the legal aid data project, a refresher on what the project is, the goals and objectives, and just sort of catch you up since we last discussed this project back in February. So we're really excited to share a couple of things, letting you know this deck is very rich and it's very intense. So we may not be able to have time to talk about the information as thoroughly. You have copies of the slide posted to the meeting materials if you sort of want to digest a little longer. Special shout out to Ken and Aaron, who both serve on the advisory working group for this project as well. So if either of you want to chime in, feel free to do so. Okay, so just a reminder of what the legal aid data project is and the overall goal. As you all know, this is sort of encapsulated in the PDI committee's charter. We're really looking to update the data collection and reporting framework in efforts to support transparency, mutual accountability, and impactful communication with stakeholders. Below listed are the strategies in how we aim to do that. We're looking at research of other legal aid vendors, looking at philanthropy to see what they're doing and sort of their current practices. We're doing an inventory of our own data elements and analysis of how we as a state bar could monitor and report the impact of the legal aid grants. Also taking a look at our own data that we collect and reporting summary findings to stakeholders to highlight trends and service impacts. And during that time, during the full process, engaging sort of the relevant stakeholders along the way. The advisory working group, you all who serve on the PDI committee and the Legal Services Trust Fund Commission. Here on the screen is just an updated timeline of sort of where we're at in the process. As I mentioned, this project launched back in February, and we're sort of in this April through September timeframe. Since then, we've conducted a landscape review to identify best practices. We did a lot of data analysis so far, looking at data worth 5 years, as well as 46 org analysis, which was sort of a follow-up project from the Justice Gap study that was published fairly recently. And we're sharing an update with you all today. Okay, so I'll just jump in. We're going to jump into the next 3 components, the main bodies of work. I will also just mention during this time frame, we've sort of convened with the working group twice. Our working group has about 27 members from various backgrounds, including our legal aid organizations. We have the representatives from the Legal Services Trust Fund Commission, Judicial Council, and some other folks, just to get sort of a mix of perspectives. Okay, so the first section I'll talk about briefly is the landscape review. Leading this review, this is what we started doing back in February, were 4 research questions. Those were, what are the current approaches to monitor, measure, and communicate the impact of legal aid? How does the state bar analyze and communicate impact? How can data collection and reporting support accountability? And then what direction is philanthropy moving in on data collection and reporting? Okay, just a glimpse of these images sort of just represent the types of resources that we were looking at. As I mentioned, we were doing research on other state bar associations. We were looking at the Legal Services Corporation and other national legal service organizations. We looked at our own providers, and then as well sort of layering in what we found through academic research and program evaluation. Okay, I'll go through these pretty quickly, but again, everyone has time to take a closer look at the slides. I'm happy to answer any questions, but just sort of 4 main slides I'll share from this very thorough landscape analysis that our colleague Debbie Mayer had sort of led for this. So this is just some findings from the legal aid report, landscape findings. I'll highlight a couple here. 1, inputs and outputs are the most frequently reported. I think this is unsurprising just because in providing services. Sort of that seem to be the easiest metric to report: number of cases closed, number of people served, for example. One other thing I'll just call out from this slide is that the primary impact data, the way that other legal aid organizations sort of communicated this impact, was through this economic impact data type of figure, which estimates basically the ROI, or return on investment, from legal aid funding. So it's something on the lines of, for every dollar of legal aid, we're able to assist X amount of people. That's something that we saw in the state, as well as looking at some other states who report this type of data. And then I think, unsurprisingly, the most compelling reports that we saw just integrated like a bunch of different resources from client stories, those outputs and inputs, and then just sort of talking about the different levels of outcomes and impacts. Okay, so we also then looked at the State Bar's current legal aid reporting and sort of the current publications that we do have. Just to call out, most of the State Bar's legal aid publications are really either grant specific, and they're mainly developed to fulfill funder requirements. We also focus on inputs, outputs, and legal outcomes. And then just our text, our sort of the format of which we do, it's very text heavy. I think we're trying to transition out of that and moving from larger reports to sort of punchier graphics that sort of can give us a high level summary in just a couple of pages of the work that our grantees are doing, and the impact and outputs of those services. Okay. This is just talking about the accountability findings, and sort of one thing I'll call out here is that the ABA and the Legal Services Corporation's performance standards support legal aid provider accountability. Those standards focus on the quality of the implementation, not necessarily the outcomes or the impact of work. And what we do here for our grants is that we conduct monitoring visits, which are a common accountability mechanism, but they do look a little bit different depending on the funder type. Philanthropy, just one thing I'll mention, we do have a shared purpose of trying to reduce a grantee reporting burden, which again is built into the larger project plan. And there's sort of a different approach with how they do evaluation and get and discuss grantee impact. And that's really a more collaborative type of approach. Again, sort of, yeah, just a much more collaborative in comparing with the other types of funders. Okay. And then what we did is that our first working group meeting, we sort of shared these findings. There's a larger deck, if you could believe me, a larger deck talking about what we found from the landscape review. And just a couple of things. We also sent a post-meeting survey to the working group just to sort of get the reactions to the information. I think there was a lot of information and wanted to gather sort of their initial thoughts. I'll call out a couple of bullet points here. I don't need to read them all. According to the working group, one of the most important reasons for the State Bar to share legal aid data is to increase funding and support of legal aid. They thought that the most important audiences for the State Bar's legal aid reports were the funders and policymakers, which is not surprising. And there was also a desire, as I mentioned, for fact sheets and dashboards would be the most useful type of publications for this audience. Okay, just a couple of focus areas that we gleaned from the landscape review, and then sort of layering with the working group's feedback. A couple of focus areas are developing concise publications geared toward increasing support for legal aid from legal aid policymakers and funders. We're trying to ensure data quality and support grantees to collect more client-centered outcomes data and use this data in those publications. Next phase that we've done, there's a lot of work that we've done since February, was a 5-year look back. We looked at grantee data from 2020 through 2024. That pulls from all of the reports that our grantees have submitted for us. Those are the legal aid reports, which are reported across all of their funding sources. So State Bar and non-State Bar sources, which include our case summary report, the main economics benefits report, and the impact litigation and advocacy report. We also looked at the IOLTA EAF applications for a couple of reference data points, and the U.S. Census when it came in particular to demographic information. I'll keep this on for a little bit longer than I've kept the other slides. This is just, we really like this slide. It's really shows sort of the 5-year impact at a glance, rolling up as much as we could to get large totals. Over the last 5 years, 650 million of state board grants have been dispersed. And you can see in the top number, we have over a million for client serve cases closed and other services. And then sort of rolling up our main benefits and client money served for clients and money saved. Those are also in the 400+ million range. Okay, this data, I will say also this deck that we presented to the working group, there was a lot of information in there. So in this selected deck, we sort of curated a couple that the working group were had more sort of discussion or reaction to. So just wanted to share a flavor of that. Here we have the trends of the state bar funding for legal aid over the last 5 years, 85% increase from 2020 to 2024, and just sort of calling out 186% increase of discretionary grants, 72% increase from IOLTA, comparing the 2 years. And then just for EAF, that trend, although there was an increase in 2022, there's been baseline funding of about 31 million in the last few years. All right, so this is just looking at the highest and lowest funded counties over the last 5 years, and these numbers seemed pretty consistent when we look. These counties were pretty consistent across all of those 5 years. So the total amount ranged for that 5-year period, with Alpine being the lowest funded county at 11,000. That's a sum of the 5 years compared to over 105 million for Los Angeles, for who received state bar funding. And then on average, it was a 68% increase. And there's a couple of ranges within that very rounded average. All right. What was also interesting to the working group and what they provided a lot of feedback on was just sort of the information about legal aid staff. You could just see here at a glance that there's been an increase in both attorney staff FTEs and non-attorney staff FTEs, 30% and 47% accordingly. And then pro bono, I think initially in that presentation, we had stacked pro bono information with the staff, and the working group did let us know that they shouldn't be combined together. So we've separated them out just so you can take a look at both the number of pro bono attorneys and the compared to the number of pro bono hours. Both are sort of increases year after year for the most part. Okay, this slide talks about the other services. So these are your non-representational services. As you recall from that last slide, it's well over 1 million other services that were provided from 2020 to 2024. You can see that increase in the hotline calls since 2023. Self-help clinics more than tripled. And then you can just see some sort of nuances of slight dips in other services in 21 and 22. We're attributing that possibly to the sort of the pandemic and during that time frame.
And Crystal,
and
I'm
then
so sorry to interrupt, but
Yes.
we're gonna need to save a few minutes for a final update from Danielle. So I don't know if you
Okay.
want to reach like a comfortable stopping spot. I know you said at the beginning we've posted the slides so
We
everyone can
did.
sit with them, and we'll talk about
Yes.
them in October. But I also wanted to let you reach like a nice stopping spot too.
Okay, yeah, so I wasn't aware of the plan for the rest of the meeting, so we were truncating this from our 30 minutes to 15, but let me go ahead and advance. Okay. Thank you. So this slide, which you could take a closer look after the meeting, was just sort of comparing benefits versus people served over time and sort of seeing that interesting difference as time goes on. Working group feedback, which I won't read today, but that was responses to the 5-year impact. Then I will turn it over to Lizette. We'll talk about the analysis of the 46 legal aid orgs very briefly. Sorry about that, Lizette.
Yeah, just quickly, going over the analysis of the 46 legal aid organizations. So just going over, just letting everyone know what we did here, and then if you have any questions, we're available. But just we looked at the organizations that filled out an intake census in 2019 and in 2024, and we saw that the percent of problems fully served declined from 28% to 23%. And again, the purpose of this analysis was to explore the relationship between demand measured by the number of problems received, which we saw decline from 2019 to 2024, also including state bar funding and total funding and the percent of problems fully served. So this analysis looks at the organizations, which we then decided to analyze a subset of them, which you can all see there, and also including like the working group insights that we included. And if you have any questions, we're free to answer. Thank you.
Both of you are heroes for delivering what was supposed to be a slightly longer presentation in a smaller time container. I'm so thankful to you, Crystal and Lisette, for pivoting with me on that, because we want to make sure that we can end as close to on time as possible, and we also wanted to make sure we have time for Danielle's update, which is better to deliver in this meeting than to wait till October. So if we may, so thank you, Crystal and Lisette. The slides are posted. The data is available. I think we will circle back to it. And Danielle, if you're ready, we would like for your update to go to.
Yes, so I have no slides. It's just a quick oral update on some state bar initiatives related to Business and Professions Code Section 6033 and increasing Cypre donations to legal aid, hopefully. So as you may know, Business and Professions Code 6033 requires attorney donations for legal aid made through the fee bill cycle to be distributed by IOLTA formula. Those currently get kind of funneled into what we call the Justice Gap Fund. It also requires the State Bar to periodically review and adjust as needed how those funds, those contribution amounts are, the method by which and the amount of those voluntary contribution amounts that are made through the license fee bill. State Bar is undergoing that review requirement, that second piece now. So we're collecting data on giving rates, donation totals, any impact of fee increases, and can provide more information on that in the future. Also plan to engage LAC and grantees in that review as appropriate. You may be aware, I think you are aware, the State Bar and Commission pursued a statutory change to allow more flexible use of those donations, particularly wanted to set up or change the statutory language such that those funds could be used to fund projects to respond to urgent and emerging issues, and would also simplify the language around those review requirements, but instead would require the Commission to set annual funding priorities. Unfortunately, that statutory change is not moving forward at this time, or we have not received indication at this point that it will. That's kind of stalled out. But in addition to that work, the State Bar has been working to increase Cypre donations to legal aid. So I think you all are aware, but for the purposes of members of the public that may be attending or watch later, Cypre is a legal doctrine that allows for unclaimed class action settlement funds to be directed to nonprofits that most closely advance the interests of the class or the purpose of the litigation. And there's a section of the California Code of Civil Procedure, Section 384, that says it's State Bar policy that those funds be distributed to further the purposes of the class action or cause, or, quote, to promote justice for all Californians. And so the State Bar's Justice Gap Fund has long been considered a qualifying Cypre designee under that section. And since 2021, we've received about $7 million donated to the Justice Gap through Cypre. But we are trying to increase that number. And so along with LAC and the Access Commission, and Ken has been involved in several of these conversations as well, we're investigating different kind of avenues to increase those donations, discussing things like, and this is all kind of at the beginning of these conversations, if you will, nothing is finalized, but discussing things like a possible change to the rules of court to ensure that settlement agreements comply with that section of the Code of Civil Procedure, potentially advocating to update settlement approval checklists so that this is more front of mind for those complex litigation judges, updating toolkits and educational materials for those complex lit judges and class action attorneys, and then also updating our CyPray declarations to provide more information on impact of legal aid, those justice gap funds, and also critically to allow us to spend those funds a little bit more flexibly. So currently, CyPray donations are distributed via IOLTA as well, but we're not statutorily required to do that with CyPray funds. That's just kind of how we've done it. I don't want to say out of convenience, that's maybe not fair, but that's been the default thus far. And so staff would like to change and is planning to change the declarations to allow us to use those funds more flexibly and perhaps be able to create a competitive grant program to administer those dollars to address urgent and emerging issues akin to what 6033 was hoping to do. And so we plan to continue to work with Ken, continue to work with LAC and the Access Commission on that work. And then once we hopefully see that increase in CyPray donations, would then kind of move forward with thinking through what this new competitive grant program would be, and would I think at that stage create a working group likely to help kind of build out what that grant program would look like. But wanted to provide an update on our current work, and particularly around updating that declaration. I see Selena has her hand raised.
My comment's just really fast. It's about the CyPray piece. And I think that we have been talking a lot as a community around the kind of urgent projects that don't otherwise have dedicated funding. And this seems to be a very easy way. If nothing else, you can designate a couple of CyPray awards to be made available for an urgent, important, something that otherwise would not have enough funding through IOLTA formula process. So we're in support of this change.
Great, thanks, Selena.
I just want to add quickly, like this is a really great kind of groundbreaking, creative kind of project. One thing that we're going to be working really closely with the Access Commission is on judicial education. So there was a judge that used to sit on our commission, Judge Seligman, who has now turned off. And he used to do a wonderful training for the complex the judges in complex lit. They have like they meet annually or a couple times, and he used to do that. So he's going to actually be doing that on our behalf at the next convening that they have later this year. So I think that is one avenue. And then because the Access Commission has a lot of kind of judicial officers on there, we're going to be trying to work with them to kind of build that out, because a lot of this is like, there's a compliance piece, right? There's a code of civil procedures, and it's just not being done now. So, but hopefully with if we move forward with a court rule, that might be another means to be like, now you need to comply. And if there's a way to work with like the Judicial Council as a whole to kind of bring, again, more broad judicial education to this, then we do think that the money, again, like, and it won't benefit just the state bar and legal aid, but if more judges elect a designee, nonprofits, food banks in general are going to benefit from this. Legal aid will benefit from this. And the last thing I'll say, I turn over to Ken, is, our uptick in CyPray funding has been really like strong the last few years. We never budget for it, but it used to be between like maybe a couple $100,000 to like, but the last few years have been really, really like robust. I mean, this year alone, I feel like every couple of years I'm signing a CyPray declaration. Like I've signed, I think 3 in the last like 2 months, which is, a lot. And one of them, I think a couple months ago, was $3.5 million. So there is such an opportunity here in terms of CyPray funding. That will be great. And if we can unlock it for flexible use, the commission then can think about, and again, not just the RFP, but maybe there's something to be said about disaster relief funding. If we're not going to have a pot of money for that, but it might be a little bit of slow build, but this is a great kind of opportunity.
That's awesome.
And just real quickly, the one other thing we've talked about is the idea of outreach to some of the lawyer groups that are involved in class actions, both on the plaintiff side, groups like CAOC, or on the defense side, groups like ABTL, to raise awareness with those folks as well.
That's great. Well, thank you, Danielle, for sharing that. And I appreciate everybody's comments on it as well. I see that we are just at or just over our time. I apologize again to folks for not getting to everything on our agenda, but I think it was important to have a robust conversation about the RFP, and I think that we made good changes to it, and so we will push that out in the days to come. And I want to just say one more time, Chris, how grateful we are to you for steering today and for steering all the others meetings before this one, and we will miss you. And Danielle, welcome. As you can see, we're a shy group, and nobody has any opinions about anything. So, all right. Thank you, everyone. Have a lovely rest of your week.
Thank you so much. Yeah, have a lovely afternoon. Goodbye, everybody.